Who is the whore of Babylon, and what does she represent? This is a question that we want to consider this week on Fridays with Phil. I'm Dr. Phil Mayo, and I'd like to share with you just a few minutes of biblical insight to help you along the way. If you enjoy the content, please be sure to subscribe. Over the last 2 weeks, we've taken a look at the 7 bowls, which are the 7 last plagues of the wrath of God recorded in Revelation chapter 16. In chapter 17, 18, and the beginning of chapter 19 is a more focused look at the last 2 bowls of chapter 16. This week, we want to talk a little bit about chapter 17, which has actually got a lot of information in it. It's a description of the beast, the whore of Babylon, and what they might represent. This chapter is so dense, we may have to take part of it this week and part of it next week. But let's first start taking a look at the first few verses of chapter 17 and what we want to consider. So let's take a look now at chapter 17, verse 1. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute, who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." There's a lot of interesting symbolism that we want to take a look at here for a moment. First of all, we want to note that it's one of the 7 angels who has the 7 last plagues, or the 7 bowls in chapter 16, who comes to John to show him a vision or an image of Babylon, the whore of Babylon, and the beast on which she rides. So this immediately connects the images of chapter 17 with the bowls that have occurred in chapter 16. This is probably why some of the commentators, like Greg Beale in his commentary on the book of Revelation, says that chapters 17, 18, and 19 are a more focused look at what takes place in the last 2 bowls. John goes on to say that the angel invites him and want to come and see the punishment of the great prostitute. Now, the punishment of the great prostitute is really going to take place in chapter 18, and most of chapter 17 is just a description. One of the things that the angel says immediately is the great prostitute is the one who sits by many waters. Now, this is a description that we have heard before in Jeremiah 51:13. In fact, much of what we're going to see in the next 2 chapters, chapter 70, chapter 18, comes from Old Testament prophecy about Babylon. The whore, or the prostitute of Babylon, is the one who is described here in chapter 17, but the imagery of Babylon is used throughout chapter 17 and chapter 18, and it is referred to as Babylon the Great and the Great City. Why Babylon? Well, that's a question I think we'll answer perhaps in another video, but it's important imagery for what John is trying to accomplish here. So the connection immediately is made with biblical prophecy in the Old Testament about the destruction of Babylon. If you read Jeremiah 51, you'll see that it's an entire prophecy about the destruction of Babylon, and it is the language there is similar language that's used once again in the book of Revelation. He goes on to say in verse 2 of chapter 17, "With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Now notice she's called the great prostitute, and that the kings of the earth have committed adultery with her, and that they have drunk the cup of the wine of her adulteries. One of the things that I mentioned in a previous video is that sexual immorality, fornication, adultery, impurities of this nature are often used as metaphors for idolatry and for the whole sense of pursuing things that are not godly. They're called, in general, abominations. And of course, we'll see that word used later in chapter 17. We saw this kind of language used in the messages to the churches, a couple of the messages where Balaam is mentioned in the Old Testament and Jezebel is mentioned. In both of those situations, they're causing people in the churches to eat food sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. And both of these things could actually be literal things because this was the kind of activity that took place at pagan temples, but they could also be figurative for just unfaithfulness to God. This was the kind of imagery that was used in the Old Testament for Israel's unfaithfulness to God, that she was called a prostitute and she was called an adulteress. So let's go on to 17:3. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast who was covered with blasphemous names and had seven heads and 10 horns. Now this is of course the beast that we saw in chapter 13, same description, and the scarlet color connects it with the dragon, which was the description of the dragon in chapter 12 of Revelation. So this beast is aligned with Satan and is that represents that worldly empire, worldly kingdom that stands in contrast to what God stands for. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. Now, the description here of the wealth and the riches, the adornment, is consistent with the way a prostitute, of course, would adorn itself to allure men into her trade. So there's some of that. There's also the idea here that part of the abominations that the kings of the earth and that the prostitute herself has committed is that they have given themselves over to luxury, to wealth, to the things of the world, to pursuing those things. There's a real dichotomy in the book of Revelation between the inhabitants of the earth, which you hear mentioned in verse 3, or rather in verse 2 of chapter 17, and the people of God. And the people of God are sealed on their forehead. They have written on their forehead the name of the Lamb and of God and the Lamb. And the people who serve the beast are marked with the beast on their forehead. You see here that she has written on her forehead, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes. And so this idea of the forehead is very interesting because it symbolically kind of represents a billboard. It's the place where people see what you're dedicated to. As you wear it on your forehead, it's the idea that what you do in your life and what you value and what you commit yourself to is evident by your actions. Jesus told the Pharisees in Luke chapter 16 that the things that people value are an abomination in God's sight. And so the values of the world, of the culture, the things of the earth are in contrast to the qualities and values that God has. And this is what the prostitute represents. 8 times in the book of Revelation, the forehead is mentioned. 4 times it's mentioned in connection with the mark of the beast, and 4 times it's mentioned, or maybe I should say more broadly, the mark of the beast and the kingdom of the earth, because here it's with the prostitute. And then secondly, the other 4 times it's mentioned with the people of God, and that they have their name of God and of the Lamb written on their forehead. So it's about who you belong to and whose values you share. It's very similar to the Old Testament where God told Israel to bind on their forehead his word. That's why they wore a phylactery on their foreheads, to show that they were bound to and dedicated to the covenant and the commandments of God. So what we're increasingly seeing in the book of Revelation is this division between the people who are committed to God and the people who are committed to Satan. Now, right now, it appears that Satan and his kingdom have the upper hand. And you see one of the last things that's mentioned here in verse 6 is, I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. This is her greatest sin, and the one that will lead ultimately to her punishment. This takes us back to seal number 5, where the martyrs under the altar said, how long, O Lord, before you avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth? And so now we're coming to that point, we're coming to that climax that we'll soon arrive at in chapter 19 and 20, where the clash between Satan's kingdom and God's kingdom will come, and God will destroy the beast, the false prophet, and bind Satan. So this is kind of just an introduction to what's happening here in chapter 17. Next week, we'll talk a little more about what she represents, both in the first century and now in our present time. And we'll also talk a little bit, perhaps next week, about why Babylon is used as a metaphor for the kingdoms of the earth. Won't you join me? Thank you, and God bless you.